What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Modern Goonies Cinema, where we analyze and review movies and TV. I'm your host, Trevor. So for this episode, I want to talk about one of my favorite films of all time, which is the 2014 film Whiplash, written and directed by Damien Chazelle. I really want to analyze some of the themes of the movie, along with giving some of my overall personal thoughts and sentiments on it. So this video will be a combination of analysis and a personal love letter to the film. This movie means a whole lot to me, and it really hits a note that is deeply personal in regards to my upbringing. So I have a lot to say about it, and I am extremely excited to talk about it. But before we start, this is a good time to point out that I will be referring to the main character, Neiman, as Naaman. And the reason for that is because that's his actual name, but we'll get into that a little bit more as the video progresses. I just don't want people to be pissed off on the way that I say his name, because I hate that kind of shit in other videos. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Whiplash is short, sweet, and to the point, which is something that makes it nearly perfect to me. The premise is this: a determined student at a top-end music academy struggles to prove himself to his psychologically and physically abusive jazz instructor. That's it. And I guess this is actually where the first misconception about this film comes in. Despite what you heard in that premise, this film is not about jazz, or about drumming, which is the instrument that the main character plays. This film is about achieving greatness and the sacrifices that one is willing to undergo in order to do so. Are those sacrifices even worth it? Where is the line, and is there any at all? Do the ends justify the means? All questions that you're meant to grapple with throughout. I've heard this common criticism of the film where music bros will be like, "Oh, Naaman isn't even all that good of a drummer," or "This isn't what competitive jazz is like." And if you're one of those people, I think you're definitely missing the point. First of all, this movie is based on Damien Chazelle's own personal experience within the industry, as he was once a jazz drummer himself. And you can't really discount that people are going to have different experiences than others, and some will inevitably have a more competitive atmosphere. And secondly, this movie could have just as easily been about basketball, football, art, academics, or what have you. The themes of the film are what you're meant to take away, and they can be translated into any facet of life that has any kind of competitive angle to it. How much are you willing to sacrifice to be great at something? All of the heavy themes that you can take away from this film lie entangled in that very simple premise. And what a ride it is. The stakes in this movie are, technically speaking, very low. The absolute worst thing that can happen is that Naaman gets kicked out of Schaefer, or he has to drum with a lower level band of the school called Nassau. But the stakes feel incredibly high because of Naaman's own determination and the menacing and imposing nature of Terrence Fletcher, his instructor. If Naaman so much as slightly drums off beat, Fletcher will relentlessly tear him down, humiliate him, and even physically assault him, all while using Naaman's own determination and goals against him. To Naaman, failing to live up to Fletcher's standards would be the end of the world. Everything he ever wants would be stripped from him. So to us, the stakes feel like they have this grave consequence to them. And if you've ever had a hard-ass coach in your life, you know exactly how this feels. You know that it's not the end of the world if your coach screams at you in front of everyone or kicks you off the team. But the humiliation of it all and the consequence of no longer getting to play a sport that you love make you feel like this man's approval is the blessing of God. You cannot be who you want to be and do what you want to do without the sole approval of this one man. He yields total power over you in a very specific and intimate way. But let's take it back a second and talk about this film as it progresses. To start with, the opening scene of this film is just flawless, because it outlines the entire course and dynamic of the film in one scene between Fletcher and Naaman. Naaman is practicing hard, and then Fletcher randomly comes in and gives him an impromptu coaching session, making jabs at him when he can, and then turns and leaves without saying a word, leaving Naaman confused and wanting to practice even harder. You know everything you need to know about the dynamic between these two from this one scene. The movie just draws it out and expands on it the further it goes along. Even Chazelle himself has said that the ending of the film is essentially just the beginning of it. Also, going back to the intro where I was talking about what Naaman's name actually is.
My little kind of joke that I don't know if people get is, yeah, his actual name is Naaman, but Fletcher just decides it's Neiman, which is just, to me, it's like just a further tiny way of just, you know, Neiman sounds a little more reductive, a little more small, so I'm gonna call you Neiman.
What's your name?
And your name, sir?
We got a squeaker today, people. Neiman. 19 years old. Isn't he cute?
So let's fast forward a little bit and talk about Naaman's family dynamic, which is pretty important to the film, if not central. Immediately after the film introduces us to Fletcher, the very next scene we're shown Andrew going to the movies with his father. And the interaction between Naaman and his father really shows you a lot about Naaman's mindset and later why he really craves the approval of Fletcher.
Yeah, I don't know. He saw me play today.
And? Well, you got plenty of options still.
What does that mean?
Just
other options.
Just, it's just life.
And you can tell that this is actually kind of insulting to Naaman because, as you learn throughout the film, there really is no other option for him. This is what he wants to do and what he wants to be good at. And his father's response goes into a smaller statement that the movie makes about what people think of the arts and how they aren't taken as seriously as any other competitive medium or any other job field. Because there's definitely a clear double standard in his response. For instance, if Naaman was, say, studying law instead of jazz drumming, and he came home one day and he was upset because he didn't do too well on one of his exams, do you think that Naaman's father would have had that same response? No, because just because you make a bad grade doesn't mean that you're going to fail or that you should just give up. It just means you have to try harder on the next test whenever it comes around if you want to stick with it. And the same mindset should theoretically be applied here to drumming, but it isn't, and I think that makes a poignant statement. Naaman's father just immediately says that it's okay to give up. I've seen people take this a few different ways of what Naaman's father actually means in his response, and I think it's a combination of criticism of the stigma of the arts and Naaman's father being a stand-in for the traditional path that people take in life. Some say that he's a stand-in for mediocrity itself, and I don't totally disagree with that, but I think he's more representative of the safe path in life than he is anything else. The majority of us don't take the path to greatness and aren't willing to make such extreme sacrifices, which is still not a bad thing. And this exact point is made by his father and the rest of his family at the dinner table scene, which let's go ahead and jump to.
Come on, the talent at this table, that is stunning. And Andy, with your drumming.
It's going okay, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, it's going really, really well, actually. I'm part of Schaefer's top jazz orchestra, which means it's the best in the country, and I'm a core member, so I'll start playing in competitions, and actually I found out I'm the youngest person in the entire band.
Well, how do you know who wins in a music competition? Isn't it subjective?
No.
Does the studio get you a job?
No, it's not an actual studio. It's just the name of the ensemble. But yeah, it's a big step forward in my career.
Well, I'm so glad you figured it out. It's a nasty business, I am sure. Oh, hey, are you going to tell them about your game this week? Huh? Living up to your title?
What up? I scored a 93-yard touchdown.
School record, school record, school record. That's true.
So, as you can see from watching the scene, this is all pretty insulting to Naaman, who's worked very hard to get to where he is. Since Schaefer is essentially this world's stand-in for Juilliard, Naaman basically just told his family that he's the top drummer in the entire country. And yet they still don't take him or his drumming seriously, and instead choose to brag on the cousins who, as Naaman later points out, are only Division III football players. Naaman's accomplishment is far more impressive, but he's only a footnote in the discussion. Because, as I'd argue, and I think most people would agree, the average person kinda has a stigmatized view of the arts, and typically views outlets like sports to be the one that is glamorized and applauded. All of this is what prompts Naaman to lash out. Immediately upon the outburst, Naaman's uncle responds by asking if Naaman has any friends. And it's here that you can really see the point that this movie is trying to make with this interaction. And it's that all of the members of Naaman's family have taken the traditional path in life. They all have a lot of friends and have stable lives and careers. Naaman's dad even being school teacher of the year. But Naaman turns his nose up on all of that because it's not what he values in his life. He wants to be remembered. He wants to be great, even if that means dying broke and alone. He relates himself to the Charlie Parker story here, which is a central metaphor of the entire movie.
Charlie Parker didn't know anybody until Joe Jonas threw a cymbal at his head.
So that's your idea of success, huh?
I think being the greatest musician of the 20th century is anybody's idea of success.
Dying
broke and drunk and full of heroin at the age of 34 is not exactly my idea of success.
I'd rather die drunk, broke at 34 and have people at a dinner table talk about me than live to be rich and sober at 90 and nobody remember who I was.
Ah, but your friends will remember you. That's the point.
None of us were friends with Charlie Parker.
This is what the movie is arguing the entire time. How much of your soul are you willing to sell to become great? And is it worth it? And Naaman is fully admitting to his family that he's willing to give up everything just to be remembered like Charlie Parker is. A sentiment that his family fundamentally does not understand, nor do they agree with. So yeah, I mean, full disclosure, while I do think this movie is near perfect, there are some elements that I think are a little half-baked, and I think some of the stuff with the family is. For instance, this is the only scene that you see the aunt, uncle, or cousins, and you only really get a few scenes with Naaman's father. And don't get me wrong, I think the few scenes that we do have perfectly get the point across. But I can't help but think that a little bit more development with these characters would have really made that much more of an impact, especially more development with the father, as you can really see this father-son undertone with the mentor-student relationship that Fletcher and Naaman have. And you can clearly see that this kind of dynamic really bothers Naaman's father.
Oh, so how's it going with the studio band?
Good. Yeah, I think he likes me more now.
And his opinion means a lot to you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Wanna grab the shakers?
But, you know, that's just my nitpick. The story's still amazing. Alright, now let's backtrack a little bit and talk about Fletcher and Naaman. So going back to the opening scene, Fletcher catches Naaman practicing either really early in the morning or really late at night. I can't really tell. But it's at such an odd hour that you can tell Naaman has a lot of determination in what he's doing. You can tell that this is an action that Fletcher really appreciates because he asks Naaman to do double-time swing, subtly nodding to him that this is what he's going to be looking for whenever he's picking new members for his band. And Naaman picks up on this, because when the core drummer of Nassau, Connolly, returns from a short absence, he's appalled that Naaman can't play the music that the Nassau band is playing, asking him,
What have you been practicing?
And obviously this was because Naaman was working on his double-time swing, not the assigned music. Fletcher then comes into the Nassau band and auditions each of them for a hilariously short amount of time, where he quickly picks Naaman as the new alternate drummer. Now, no matter what's said about Fletcher to cast him in any sort of positive light, he is an extremely manipulative person, bordering on straight sociopathic. But he's also a man with a very specific vision. So he does a lot of stuff to Naaman that is simultaneously incredibly fucked up and a twisted sense of his determination. He's essentially manipulating Naaman from the beginning of the film, but you don't really start to explicitly see it until Naaman gets accepted into Fletcher's band. The very first thing he does is tell Naaman to get to band practice at 6 a.m. sharp, but the actual band practice doesn't begin until 9, leaving Naaman to sit idly by for 3 hours for practically no reason. He then introduces Naaman to the whole band as
Neiman.
not even bothering to get his name correct. Then Fletcher utterly humiliates another member of the band, Metz, for being slightly out of tune, and kicks him out of the band, all on Naaman's first day. However, it isn't Metz that's out of tune, it's actually Erickson. The sin of not being confident in his abilities is actually the thing that gets him kicked out. And since all of this happens on Naaman's first day, I would be willing to say that this entire thing with Metz is actually more about Naaman than it is Metz. A show of force to show exactly what it takes to be in Fletcher's band and to be under his guidance. You have to have determination and you have to know what you're doing. And immediately following this gigantic outburst, Fletcher leads Naaman into a false sense of security.
The key is to just relax. Don't worry about the numbers. Don't worry about what the other guys are thinking. You're here for a reason. You believe that, right?
Yeah.
Here, Fletcher brings up the Charlie Parker story, which is actually the first use of it in the film. And this is a highly important story in this film because this entire movie is the Charlie Parker metaphor.
You know, Charlie Parker became Bird because Jones threw a symbol at his head. See what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
For those who don't know, Fletcher tells the story of how Charlie Parker was playing saxophone up on stage one day.
Parker's a young kid, pretty good on the sax. Gets up to play at a cutting session, then he fucks it up. And Jones nearly decapitates him for it. and he's laughed off stage. Cries himself to sleep that night, but the next morning, what does he do? He practices. And he practices and he practices with one goal in mind, never to be laughed at again. And a year later, he goes back to the Reno, and he steps up on that stage and he plays the best motherfucking solo the world has ever heard.
Now, some people are going to point out how this story isn't entirely accurate to how it went down in real life, but it doesn't really matter. It's what the story represents that both Fletcher and Naaman cling to and use as motivation. Anyway, back to the scene. Naaman drops his guard and proceeds to give personal details about himself whenever Fletcher asks him. And it seems kind of like bonding in the moment, but all of this information is immediately used against Naaman the second he gets on the drums for the first time, in what is one of my favorite movie scenes of all time. Fletcher starts off as encouraging, but the second that Naaman starts to play just a little out of time, he gets progressively more serious until he has an outburst that completely dismantles Naaman as a person. He uses all of those personal details against Naaman, how his mother ran out on him when he was little, and how his father is kind of just mediocre, and resorts to physically assaulting Naaman as he's slapping him repeatedly in the face while screaming at the top of his lungs. Now, with the Charlie Parker metaphor in mind, let's take a look back at how Fletcher starts off this outburst. Yeah, he throws a chair at Naaman's head. Fletcher is using the Charlie Parker metaphor as his method of teaching, and this is the first moment of it being used in a small way. He hurls something at Naaman's head, just like Joe Jones did, and he proceeds to utterly humiliate him, just as Charlie Parker felt when leaving the stage. Here, Naaman has two options: run out crying like Metz did, or continue to practice harder. And what's brilliant is that the final scene of the entire movie is essentially just this interaction on a much grander scale. Fletcher utterly humiliates Naaman, and he has the option of either running off stage or trying to prove Fletcher wrong. There are a whole lot of points to be made on the iconic "not quite my tempo" scene, but I'm really only going to stick to one. Naaman's drumming wasn't bad. He wasn't playing out of time as much as Fletcher insisted that he was. It didn't matter if Naaman drummed flawlessly, because Fletcher was still going to tear him down no matter what. The whole outburst was just to prove a point to Naaman. If he wants to be great, he's got to work extremely hard. The entire point of this scene was for Fletcher to break Naaman down so he could mold him into something new, to keep him from getting complacent and see if he had what it took to take his skills to a level beyond. Which, if you're trying to control or manipulate someone, or just really push them past their boundaries and limits, breaking them down is kind of the first step. You know, like basic training and all that. And I just absolutely love the way that this scene is done. It's extremely realistic, and it even nails the subtleties of being put uncomfortably on the spot. For instance, before Fletcher has a total outburst, he just casually tells Naaman to stop playing. But he keeps doing that, and it's slowly building all this pressure on Naaman, making him mess up even more than he already was, starting to drum a few times before Fletcher had even given his cue. It's just so damn good. If you've ever had someone looking over your shoulder for any type of task, or your coach watching you really closely during a drill, then you know this kind of anxiety that you feel when someone is just hovering over you, making you fumble where you would normally not. And even Naaman's reaction is perfect. I know a lot of us would like to think that if we were ever spoken to in such an egregious manner that we wouldn't tolerate it. But that's just not the case. Especially if you're young and you're doing something that you really want to do and you really want it to work out. You're willing to put up with a lot more abuse than you normally ever would in any other circumstance. So watching Naaman just shrink and wither was such a painfully real reaction. I just think that it's one of the most well-written and well-acted scenes in all of cinema history. And both J.K. Simmons and Miles Teller were just masterful at bringing it to life. Moving on, as we see by the immediate aftermath of the scene, Naaman is not discouraged by Fletcher's abuse, and continues to practice to the point of utter insanity. He moves his bed into the practice room, he listens to nothing but jazz drumming, and he plays the drums until his hands literally bleed. Also, the shots of the bloody hand going into the bucket of ice is just fucking baller. So Naaman continues to repeat this insanity until it actually pays off one day at a competition, where he accidentally misplaces Tanner's music folder, Tanner being the core drummer ahead of Naaman. Tanner leaves the folder in Naaman's possession, who then sets it down in a chair next to a vending machine while he grabs a drink. But when Naaman turns around, the folder has vanished. Tanner absolutely loses his ever-loving mind on Naaman, which I think is just a hilarious way to show how all of these players are so stressed at the thought of Fletcher going off on them, which is actually the reason that all of these guys are complete fucking dicks to each other. It's like the competitive jazz version of shit rolls downhill. No one wants to be berated or demoted, so they're all brutal to one another. Even the mild-mannered Naaman eventually ends up exploding on people whenever the tensions are high. Tanner, who's unable to play music without visual cues, is unable to perform at this competition. So Fletcher decides to give the part to Naaman, since Naaman has practiced the music so much that he has it all memorized. Naaman manages to perform perfectly, all while Fletcher intensely stares him down, just waiting for him to make a mistake. Which is terrifying, but also fucking hilarious at the same time. But it's just such a great underdog moment, which is undercut just a couple scenes later, but still a great moment nonetheless. Now, I've seen a whole lot of videos on theories of who took Tanner's music folder and why. There's actually a great one by Gous, and I hope I'm saying that right, I'm sorry if I'm not, who gives a lot of very good takes on analyzing that moment in particular. But I personally don't really want to get into the weeds of it all because I don't really think it matters at the end of the day, but I will give my brief take on it. I think it was Fletcher. Now, whether or not it was some orchestrated scheme, that is completely up to you on how far you want to take the theory, but I personally think that it is entirely within Fletcher's character to take that folder. What you understand about Fletcher by the end of the film is that he's willing to go to psychopathic lengths to test Naaman's determination and will, as we see when he brings in Connolly as another alternate drummer, as he tortures all three of the drummers for an entire night, or as we see at the very end of the film when he's willing to even sabotage his own band just to either push or humiliate Naaman one final time. So the mere act of taking a folder is not all that far-fetched. And before the folder even goes missing, we are cued into its importance immediately in the scene prior.
One more thing, Eugene, give me that. If I ever find one of these lying around again, I swear to fucking God, I will stop being so polite. Get the fuck out of my sight before I demolish you.
Then, the very next scene, we see Naaman leaving a folder in a chair. We obviously don't see who comes by and takes it, but either way, it was left just lying around, like Fletcher said he hated. I think Fletcher just happened to walk by and see a folder that was unattended, so he grabbed it and took off with it, and then retroactively used it as an opportunity to put Naaman to the test. But I certainly don't think that Fletcher was skulking around with the explicit intent of taking Naaman's folder. I just think that he's an instructor who just told everyone not to leave things lying around, and then saw one of his students do just that. Because as we see throughout the entire film, Fletcher is not someone that you just disregard their instructions. Someone would have to be punished in some way. Fletcher even kind of seems to play dumb whenever Tanner comes clean about losing the folder. He acts surprised that Tanner can't play the music without visual cues. Yet, Tanner is baffled and he says,
you know this.
And I think Fletcher is far too of a calculating person to forget a detail like that. So he uses this as an opportunity to see if Naaman understood his previous lesson of humiliating him in front of the entire band. But even if Fletcher wasn't the person that took the folder, I think the last point is still the case. Which is why it doesn't really matter who took the folder at the end of the day. Whether Fletcher took it or a janitor did, Fletcher still uses it as an opportunity to test Naaman. It's just up to you to determine how calculated of a move it really was. Now, this does lead me to talk about a slight issue that I have with this film, and it's that it does tend to rely on coincidence in a few key moments. And that actually just so happens to be one of my biggest pet peeves in watching a movie. Coincidence once or twice, okay, that's fine. But anything past that is a little much for me. Barring all of the theories on who took the folder and why, it's still very coincidental that on the night of a big performance, it was Tanner's folder of all all folders, that was the one that went missing. And even if it was a very calculated move by Fletcher, it's still very coincidental that he would happen to walk by at the exact moment that Naaman left it lying in a chair. So we have the whole folder moment. We have the moment at the very beginning where Fletcher just so happens to find Naaman playing drums at a very odd hour. We have Naaman's bus breaking down right before a big performance. Then we have Naaman getting struck by a car, which causes him to not be able to play properly in said performance. It can be argued that him not paying attention because of the stress is what caused the car crash, so it's not really a coincidence, but even still, a bus breakdown and then a car crash within 5 minutes of each other is a little bit much. Then we have Naaman just casually strolling through a big city, and he just so happens to come across a sign with Fletcher's name on it. Then Fletcher just so happens to see Naaman out of everyone in this crowded bar, which leads everything into the final climax of the film. There's just too many instances of chance, and it makes some elements of the story start to seem a little unrealistic. And I also think it strips a bit of agency from Naaman. He doesn't earn his first performance with nothing but sheer determination. A folder vanishes with no explanation. He doesn't mess up his chances at Schaefer through faults of his own. A bus breakdown and a car crash do that for him. He doesn't seek Fletcher out through his own personal reasons at the end of the film. He happens to stroll by a sign. He's simply reacting to fate in all of these circumstances rather than creating his own. Now, there's also a whole other way to interpret all of this coincidence, and it's that becoming great also has a lot to do with when preparation meets opportunity. And that is certainly true almost all of the time. Just about every celebrity has a whole plethora of stories where if just one little thing had gone differently, they wouldn't have become who they are today. It could also be saying that if you're meant to become great, then not even the chaos of fate can stop you from achieving your destiny, if you are that determined. Which is kind of the philosophy that Fletcher seems to embody. That's a bit of an optimistic view on it, and I am admittedly stretching, but it's still a conclusion you could choose to walk away with. But I do think all of the coincidences are a bit much, and it's one of the few things that keep this movie from being totally perfect in my eyes. Alright, now moving on to Connolly. So after Naaman's first successful performance and promotion to the new core drummer, this is when his confidence begins to grow. Shortly after this is when Naaman has the dinner with his family, and he's actually brazen enough to confront them on their ideals. And this is something that you really couldn't see Naaman doing at the beginning of the film. You also see him being a bit more comfortable with the people in the band and being more confident in himself and his abilities, and even more comfortable when speaking with Fletcher. He does all of this in a manner where you can see that he's very proud of himself. And obviously, if we can see this, then you can bet your ass that Fletcher does too. And this is why, as soon as we start to see this more confident version of Naaman, we see Fletcher bring in Connolly to the studio band and give him a shot with such ease. Here, his motivations are clear as day. As we know from the conversation at the end of the film, Fletcher sees the words "good job" as detrimental to someone's development. As soon as he saw that Naaman was gaining confidence, his first reaction was to tear him down and push him yet again.
Oh, that is a double time swing. That's what got you in here, right?
Oh, yeah.
As fate would have it, I recently stumbled across another kid in a practice room working on his double time swing. So I'm gonna give him a shot.
He can't allow Naaman to become complacent if he plans on molding him into one of the greats.
What about Ryan Conley?
All Connolly ever was to me was incentive for you.
And Naaman's immediate reaction to Fletcher bringing in Connolly is to go on another insane practicing bender and even end things with his new girlfriend Nicole, so he can do nothing but focus on drumming and have zero outside distractions. In reference to ending things with Nicole, I really like the angle that this movie tried to tackle, but there is one big flaw with it, which I'll get to in a moment. In terms of the positive, I think the overall statement the movie makes is a good one. Naaman was really excited to start dating Nicole, but overall he cares way more about trying to become one of the greats than he does trying to maintain any kind of personal relationship, which he made explicitly clear at the dinner table scene. But I feel like this is really the first explicit example of Naaman beginning to sell his soul, and not just talking big like he did at dinner. He's now fully willing and able to give up basic pleasures of life just so he can accomplish his goals. However, Naaman and Nicole were shown to have a fundamental fundamental disconnect from their very first date. I'd argue that Naaman has a fundamental disconnect with all of his relationships outside of Schaefer, but I think it shines an interesting light on the concept whenever it's framed in a romantic manner.
What do you do?
I go to Fordham.
What do you study?
I don't have a major yet.
But like, what do you want to study?
I don't really know. I don't know yet.
So Fordham was just like a random school?
No, I applied to a bunch of schools and Fordham let me in. Why'd you pick Schaefer?
It's the best music school in the country.
Well, Fordham was Fordham.
You can see that Naaman genuinely doesn't understand how someone can be so unsure of what they want out of life, because he knows exactly what he wants to do and he doesn't really consider any other options. And their breakup scene pretty much just says this explicitly.
And when I did see you, you treat me like shit because I'm just some girl who doesn't know what she wants, and you have a path, and you're going to be great, and I'm going to be forgotten, and therefore you won't be able to give me the time of day because you have bigger things to pursue.
That's exactly my point.
It is definitely a brutal way to end things, but I do think it's a very fascinating part of the story. And it really highlights how no one in this world understands Naaman on a fundamental level. However, the main problem that I have with their relationship is this. We just simply aren't shown enough of their relationship for it to have the impact that it's going for. Don't get me wrong, it's still a sad scene to watch for a multitude of reasons. But this really would have been a gut punch if we had had more context to their time together. We only really get a single scene of them actually being together, and it's on their date when they have that awkward little disagreement. And then some text of them going back and forth, and that's it. And you know, maybe that was the point. I actually have no idea how much time passes in this movie, so maybe they really did only have that one date and then Naaman just called it off. But either way, I feel like the film would have really benefited from more development of their relationship, making Naaman's eventual decision to cut out all external relationships all the much more difficult to watch. And that's something that becomes more and more apparent to me each time I rewatch the film. Alright, now let's talk about Shawn Casey. Immediately following the addition of Connolly to the band, Fletcher is informed of the death of his former student Shawn Casey, a trumpet player who appears to have bordered on the line of greatness, but to Fletcher's dismay just wasn't quite there. There is so much to say about Fletcher's reaction to Shawn Casey's death, especially since we retroactively know that Casey killed himself, and most likely as the eventual result of all of the trauma that had been inflicted upon him by Fletcher's methods. One of the most intriguing things about Fletcher is that his genuineness is very enigmatic. You can argue in so many different ways that he's either a full-blown psychopath or someone that genuinely does care about others' rise to greatness. And since he can code switch with such ease and is visibly manipulative at several points in the story, it makes it nearly impossible to discern his true inner feelings. And I fucking love that about him. It's why he's not a typical antagonist or even a typical mentor. He's this bipolar blend of both, and it's just brilliant. Personally, when interpreting Fletcher's genuineness in these scenarios, I feel like he is always half honest. Even if he fully says exactly how he feels, there is still some manipulation under the surface that becomes apparent later on, which will make you doubt his sincerity in its entirety, even if he actually was telling the truth. I feel like he's always honest in his mindsets and philosophy, but his demeanor and outward display of emotions can always be called into question. When we look at his reaction to Shawn Casey, he's clearly distraught upon the news of his death. And at first glance, you assume it's because he really did care about the guy deep down, or that maybe he feels guilty for being partially responsible. But when you listen to what he actually says, he only refers to Casey in terms of his ability to play music. He never mentions anything about Casey as a person or about Fletcher caring about him as a person. Only that
I wanted you guys to know he was a beautiful player. I just thought you should know.
And the fact that he doesn't cut Naaman any slack whatsoever when he finds himself in a car crash at the end of the movie goes to show that I don't think he cares about the well-being of his students in any way, and that he definitely did not learn his lesson with Casey. And immediately after he tells the studio band of Casey's death, Fletcher decides pretty much in the same breath that he's going to torture all 3 of the drummers until one of them can meet his standards. And I think the fact that this happens in the exact same scene as Fletcher discussing the loss of a potential prodigy of his is very, very telling. I once watched a whole video of someone talking about this one element of Fletcher torturing the drummers and what that meant as far as his prodigy goes. I can't remember who it was that talked about it. If I do remember, I'll link it, but just know these thoughts are not entirely my own. Later in the movie, when Fletcher and Naaman are talking in the bar, Fletcher admits that he never really had a Charlie Parker, but that he came close. A fact that he really seems to lament. So I think that Shawn Casey was probably the closest that Fletcher ever came, and now he passed before ever achieving the greatness that Fletcher had in mind. Or maybe he never quite had it all the way in the first place. So what does Fletcher do immediately after announcing Shawn Casey's death? Go to the extreme and try to mold another prodigy. So was Fletcher's reaction to Casey's death a genuine display of sorrow for the loss of a former student? Or was it a reaction to losing the closest thing he ever came to achieving one of the greats? It's possible that it's both, but either way, even in his most genuine moments, there's always a more cynical angle that can be interpreted if you look a little bit closer at Fletcher's actions and motivations. But whether or not this is the actual case is kinda up for you to decide. But with the structure of the movie and placement of scenes, I feel confident in saying that Fletcher's reaction was probably more out of the loss of greatness than it was out of the loss of life. So anyways, Fletcher tortures the drummers all night and eventually gives the part to Naaman. And this is where I would personally say that Naaman officially earns his part as core drummer in the band. No turn of fate that causes a folder to go missing. No pre-existing knowledge of what skills Fletcher would be looking for. Just him and 2 other drummers, all the best in the entire school, battling to see who can win Fletcher's approval. So, of course, with a win for Naaman comes an immediate loss. On the day of the next competition, after officially winning his part, Naaman's bus breaks down, so he's forced to rent a car so that he can make it to the venue on time. However, he forgets his sticks at the rental car company, which essentially seals his fate. And forgetting his sticks specifically is actually an interesting detail rather than just a plot device.
Hey, do you mind?
It's my part, and I decide who to lend it to. Usually it's somebody that has fucking sticks.
I left him in the car. I'll be right back. Take me 5 minutes.
I'm warming up the band now.
Look, I can use Ryan's sticks.
Neiman, you lost the fucking part.
I personally just feel like this is Fletcher's way of saying that he expects more out of Naaman and will continue to use Connolly as motivation upon any slip-up on his behalf, or any sign of complacency. Fletcher is not a forgiving man, no matter how extenuating the circumstances. So, Naaman has to race back to the rental car agency to grab his sticks, and on the way back to the concert venue, gets into a pretty horrific car crash due to his attention being on the stress of the situation and screaming into the phone rather than actually paying attention to the road. Obviously, the car crash is a huge metaphor and relates directly to the title of the movie, as the term whiplash has several meanings pertaining to the events of the film. It's the name of one of the jazz songs that the studio band plays. It's the term for when you feel emotionally jarred, and it's the term for a neck injury that one gets from being in a literal car crash. I think the car crash is definitely a metaphor for the self-destruction that Naaman is participating in. He is far too obsessed, and he's willing to push anything and anyone out of his life that doesn't directly benefit his aims. And the car crash shows what he's doing to himself. It would have never happened in the first place if he just took a healthier approach to success. And his mental state and self-imposed stakes are what cause him to drive so recklessly in the first place. But I think it's also a stark warning of where his life life will lead if he continues on down this path. I also think it's a Shawn Casey reference as well, as when Fletcher lies about the nature of Shawn Casey's death, he says that he died in a car accident. So Naaman is symbolically spiraling just as Casey had. This also reminds me of a chapter in Blood Meridian where the main character has suffered all of this abuse and carnage, and he eventually comes to, I think it's a tree that had been struck by lightning on his way back to the very same people that had caused a lot of his misery. And a lot of people interpret that as the final sign of, if you continue on down this juncture, you're fucked. And I see a lot of similarity there, and this is kind of what the car crash is to me. I think this is his final sign from fate to stop and analyze the situation. This is his final stop before he's gone too far down his obsessive road, before he sacrificed too much of his humanity for his dreams. If he continues on down this path, he will end up like Shawn Casey, or even Charlie Parker. If he had reacted to the car crash in a more normal way, it would have allowed him to slow down, gain his bearings, miss the performance, and really reflect on this kind of life, all as he has to deal with the aftermath of being in a car accident. You know, call the police, call insurance, call his family, go see a doctor, you know, all that kind of shit. But as we know, Naaman didn't do any of this. He immediately crawls his way back into this mangled car just so he can get his drumsticks, and then runs bloody and limping into the concert venue. He doesn't even stop to make sure that everyone's all right, or even look over his own injuries. He just runs away from the scene of an accident that's actually kind of serious, all for a single school jazz performance. It's all just pure insanity, and things have definitely gone too far at this point. So Naaman runs on stage where he attempts to perform in this mangled state, barely even able to sit upright. Obviously, he can't maintain this, so Fletcher stops the entire performance and tells Naaman that he's done. And since Fletcher explicitly told Naaman that if he messes up even one single note, he'd send him back to the Nassau band, Naaman feels as though his life is now over. And with nothing left to lose, he tackles Fletcher straight to the ground, curses at him repeatedly, and has to be dragged off stage. And I gotta say, this is probably one of the most satisfying scenes, not only in the entire film, just like ever. Anyone who has ever had an asshole instructor or boss has only ever dreamed of doing this type of thing. And in real life, that tackle actually broke some of J.K. Simmons' ribs, which for the actor definitely sucks, but in the context of the movie is just so gratifying to know that Fletcher got the absolute shit knocked out of him. Fletcher is such a raging psychopath that he doesn't even care about Naaman's well-being in this moment, only that he can't perform. Naaman was clearly disoriented and bleeding, but Fletcher did not try to stop him, and he did not try to stop the performance out of concern for Naaman's physical condition, which again makes me think his reaction to Shawn Casey's death had anything to do with the loss of his actual life. So with that tackle, the possibility of Naaman staying at Schaefer in any capacity is now no longer a possibility. As we see later, he has to leave the school, and he's kind of pressured into writing a testimony against Fletcher's abusive behavior, which results in Fletcher being fired from Schaefer, as the parents of Shawn Casey blame their son's mental state and eventual suicide on Fletcher's methods, and they don't want anyone else to suffer the same fate or trauma. And as I said, Naaman is kind of pressured into this. He's clearly uncomfortable with snitching on Fletcher, and he actually gets upset at his father for putting him in this situation. And of course, this baffles his father, as I'm sure it baffles some of the audience, but it actually does make a lot of sense based on everything we know about Naaman. But I'll come back to this point when I'm talking about the bar scene. So time moves on, and again, I'm not really sure how much, because passage of time in this movie is somewhat ethereal for some reason. And we see that Naaman has given up on drumming and has even packed away his drum kit, which is just so heartbreaking to see, especially for me, because I personally had to stop playing the sport that I love because the politics and the coaches turned it into an absolutely dreadful experience for me, and overall made me lose my love for the sport and actually tainting the whole game for me. Like, even nowadays when I think about it, it's just not the same. And I know how much of a fucking gut punch that is, and I know exactly how Naaman feels in that moment. It's just utterly tragic, and it's such a distinct feeling and situation that not a lot of people talk about or maybe can relate to. So to see it translated just so well in this film was really very moving. My only critique is that we don't really get to ruminate on this feeling for very long. Like, probably less than 5 minutes, actually. We don't really get to see how Naaman has to be miserable in this new, unfulfilling life. A life that he's already gutted with sacrifices, because he was so sure he couldn't live it. Getting to see how he navigates this new situation would have given us a lot of perspective on how, even though Fletcher made Naaman's life a living hell, he still preferred to live a hard life chasing his dreams than live in one where he has none at all. So I think it slightly missed the mark there. But like I said, this movie is short, sweet, and to the point, sometimes for better or for worse. Shortly after we see Naaman living this new life, he's out walking in the city one night and he strolls across a bar that has a sign with Fletcher's name on the outside, as he's performing with a band for a small audience. Naaman's curiosity is piqued, so he walks into the bar and catches a glimpse of their performance as the song's ending, to which Fletcher almost immediately recognizes Naaman and approaches him and asks him to have a drink and to talk for a little while. And this is one of the most important and amazing scenes in the entire movie. The two main characters, who were on the opposite sides of the aisle, just sitting and having a casual conversation. Fletcher no longer has any power over Naaman, at least in the literal sense. So the two are finally on a sort of even playing field, so they're able to just talk to one another without any stakes. And it's one of only 2 times where Fletcher actually addresses Naaman by his first name, which is Andrew. And to me, it's like a strangely touching thing to see. There's a very specific feeling you get when you're able to just be human with an old mentor of yours. It's a heartwarming sensation, and I feel that when the two of them are speaking, even if their relationship was really fucked up, and even if Fletcher is still manipulating Naaman here, which we know by the ending that he certainly is. But again, only to a degree. The two talk about Charlie Parker, and this time they really go in depth on what the story symbolizes. And in doing so, spell out what the overall message to the film is. And the entire dialogue that Fletcher and Naaman share about the Charlie Parker incident is the entire argument of the movie. The entire movie is literally just this one conversation, which is just such a cool thing to do. Fletcher argues that Charlie Parker became Charlie Parker because of the humiliation that he suffered at the hands of Joe Jones.
So imagine if Jones had just said, well, that's okay, Charlie. That was all right. Good job. When Charlie thinks to himself, well, shit, I did do a pretty good job. End of story. No bird.
And Naaman begins to argue what just about everyone watching the film is thinking too.
But is there a line? You know, maybe you go too far and you discourage the next Charlie Parker from ever becoming Charlie Parker?
No, man, no. Because the next Charlie Parker would never be discouraged.
Yeah.
And Fletcher's response is the crux of the entire argument. He's not concerned with discouraging anyone, because he knows that no matter how hard you push, if you have what it takes to achieve greatness, then nothing will ever stop you from pushing for it. And this is the movie's main point, which I think can be interpreted in a variety of ways. I personally grew up with a father who had this same exact mindset and is kind of like a diet version of Fletcher. And a lot of these same philosophies is exactly what I was raised with, for better or for worse. So I instinctively agree with the concept that if you want to do something in your life, then there are really no backup plans. That's what you're gonna do, and failure is not an option. If it's something that you truly love and you're truly passionate about it, then nothing will ever steer you away from your goals. And if something does, then you weren't as passionate about it as you thought you were. But the other point that this conversation makes, and the movie at large, is how much sacrifice is is too much sacrifice. Sure, you can devote your entire life to jazz drumming, but if it comes at the cost of never maintaining any social relationships, suffering chronic depression and anxiety, and dying young and drugged out, then what kind of life is that really? Sure, you achieved your goals, and it's incredibly impressive that you managed to do so, but if that kind of success comes with a lot of inner turmoil, then maybe it's really not the best thing for you. And of course, there are a lot of examples of how Fletcher's methods aren't even the best and most effective way of achieving greatness. There have been several athletes and musicians who had mentors who gave them nothing but love and support, and went on to become great all the same. But the fact of the matter doesn't change that if those extreme methods do generate even one instance of someone becoming great, then do the ends justify the means? Because for all intents and purposes, it still gave the world an absolute wonder. I think that most of us would be inclined to say that it's not worth it. Fletcher's methods have severe, long-lasting consequences on people, and can even result in their eventual deaths. And even one person being pushed to the brink like that is too much. That's not to say that tough love isn't also an effective mentoring style, but straight psychopathic and physically abusive behavior is well beyond that. And most people would agree that it violates basic human decency. But, as we see from Naaman's drum solo at the end of the movie, if you're someone that can handle that kind of abuse, then it can still produce something great even if the method is intrinsically flawed. And I think that's why the ending should be at least a little bit hard to come to terms with. Because even if you fundamentally disagree with Fletcher's methods, you still have to acknowledge that it worked for Naaman, and has the ability to work in general, under the right circumstances and for the right people. And Fletcher, in this moment, was right. Sure, in a broken clock kind of way, but you still get the point. And maybe that really was the best kind of method for Naaman to push himself. For his personality and his life, maybe that was exactly what he needed to push himself beyond his capabilities and become great. Because, as we see in his life, his family does not take his goals seriously, and his father seems to actively encourage other options. They would not be there to push Naaman, and they are not ones to indulge his obsessive behavior. They are the good job people. When Naaman talks about his goals at the beginning of the film, he does so casually. You can tell that he's motivated, but it lacks flair. But by the end of the movie, we believe him, because we see how far he's willing to go, and we see his passion in all of his outbursts. And we just have no way of knowing if this kind of fire would have been brought out of him if it hadn't have been for Fletcher. Because yeah, at the beginning, he's like, I'm gonna be one of the greats, and it's like, you know, when someone says that, you never really believe them. But then at the end, you see all this crazy shit this guy's doing, and it's like, yeah, you know what? That guy might actually be one of the greats. So sure, Fletcher is an asshole, and in just about any other circumstance, we would never tolerate such treatment of people. But for Naaman specifically, it might have actually been the best method for him. Not one that just anyone can succeed under either. And it's kind of just left up to us and our personal views if it can ever be justified in any way. Anyways, back to the conversation. When Fletcher says the part about how the next Charlie Parker would never be discouraged, Naaman smiles. You can tell that he wholeheartedly agrees with Fletcher's outlook despite all of the abuse that he's put him through. And yeah, you know, Fletcher is working Naaman a little bit here. Obviously, we know from the end that he's well aware that Naaman is the one that got him fired from Schaefer. And we know that his offer to have Naaman drum for him is just another extreme version of a test. But I actually believe that everything that Fletcher says in this scene is actually genuine. Fletcher goes out of his way to describe his mindset and his methods.
Truth is, I don't think people understood what it was I was doing at Schaefer. I was there to push people beyond what's expected of them. I believe that is an absolute necessity. Otherwise, we're depriving the world of the next Louis Armstrong, the next Charlie Parker.
And the way that he talks about it, I think can only really come from a very real place. Fletcher really does believe that he can produce one of the greats with his style. And he really does believe that it can only be done by pushing people to the brink. And that the next great will never be discouraged by that. He's not just treating everyone like shit for the hell of it, or because he cares so much about his own band being perfect. He does so because he has the goal of molding someone into one of the greats. And Fletcher is essentially applying the mindset that he pushes pushes onto his students onto himself. He's willing to push his students to the extreme, but he's also doing the same thing himself because he thinks that's what you have to do to become great. And you know, I believe that when he says it, because it's also kind of the same thing that coaches and drill sergeants do. They don't get in your face and scream at you solely because they love being sadistic. Okay, maybe some of them do, but you know what I'm trying to say. They do so because they're trying to push you to be better and to not crack under pressure, to make better players or soldiers, whether or not they actually give a shit about your physical or mental well-being. But I think solely seeing Fletcher as nothing but a psychopath is a bit reductive of his character, and lacks a bit of the nuance that comes with the student and mentor dynamic, even if Fletcher's end goal is very much self-serving. But I think that this conversation is very important to Naaman because, as we see with the people in his life, the only person who has ever understood him and understand what he aims to accomplish is Fletcher. Naaman is unable to connect with anyone else. But with Fletcher, he feels like he's finally understood, even if their dynamic is incredibly antagonistic. Fletcher really does see something in Naaman, something that no one else has paid attention to or cared to foster. Fletcher's approval really did mean the world to Naaman, outside of the power that was held over him, which is seen in the scene where Naaman's father is visibly annoyed by Naaman saying this out loud. And this is why Naaman has a hard time just ratting Fletcher out, and only really does so after being pressured by his father and the attorney. And finally, it's why Naaman even bothers walking into a bar where he sees Fletcher's name on the sign. Most people would avoid that situation like the fucking plague and just keep walking, or take the petty route and go heckle or confront the man. But Naaman doesn't do any of that. He's not even antagonistic whenever he's talking to Fletcher in the bar, and I think that's very telling. So, with all of these points in mind, let's finally talk about the ending of the film. And there's a lot to say, so bear with me. After the bar conversation, Fletcher invites Naaman to perform in another band that he's put together, stating that the drummer he currently has just isn't cutting it. Naaman eventually agrees and then breaks out his old drum kit and begins to start practicing again. And this is really something I wish we would have seen more development on. Since we know that Naaman really crushes it at the end of the film, I really wish we would have had some kind of montage of him getting back into the swing of things, literally. Because just about anyone knows that when you play an instrument, it doesn't take all that long of not playing to get a little rusty. And I think it would have made the final moments of the film have a much larger impact if we got to see Naaman build back his confidence and skills after having them locked away for so long. And also, it would have been just a little more realistic, because I mean, he gives this quote-unquote perfect badass performance after months of not playing, and I feel like it would have been much more likely he would have given that kind of performance during the time where he is practicing like a madman, but I digress. Before the concert, Naaman calls Nicole to invite her to the performance, but she says that she has a new boyfriend and she has to run it by him first. And I think this scene is really highlighting that it's now too late for Naaman to lead any kind of normal life. The sacrifices that he made at Schaefer are now there to stay. And since he didn't succeed, he's forced to live in a world with constant painful reminders of his failure and just how much he's lost on all ends. He's already sold so much of his soul for his dreams, and there's not really any turning back at this point, or really even moving on from it, as he now no longer has an outlet to process those kinds of emotions. Before the big performance, Fletcher goes out of his way to tell the whole band that the people in the audience are some of the most important in the entire industry, and they never forget, which is a very important anecdote for when he goes on to embarrass Naaman later.
You think I'm fucking stupid?
What?
I know it was you.
To which Naaman quickly realizes that the sheet music in front of him is for totally different songs that he does not know. Immediately after suffering this humiliation, Naaman walks off stage, to which he's met by his father, who embraces him after having witnessed the whole debacle. But shortly after that embrace, Naaman turns right around and goes right back on stage with a new fervor. As I said earlier, I view the father as a stand-in for the traditional way of life, and I think this moment is representative as is the final juncture for Naaman to decide what he wants his life to be. He can leave with his father and continue to live this regular life that he knows he will never gain any fulfillment from, or he can turn around and become the next Charlie Parker and endure all of the hardships that come with that. His father is the good job man that would have kept Charlie Parker from greatness, and Fletcher is Joe Jones with a symbol ready to be thrown. And I think Naaman clearly sees the fork in the road here. It's probably the most apparent it has ever been to him in his entire life, and that's why he turns around so quickly and just goes right back on stage. He sees what Fletcher is doing. He knows he can rise to the occasion, and he's accepting of all of the consequences that come with that choice. So yeah, Naaman goes back on stage, hijacks the entire band, and forces them to play Caravan, and then plays it all out with a Charlie Parker style great motherfucking solo. He's done it. He's made the metaphor a reality. And I mean, it's just a great motherfucking scene, man. I never would have thought in a million years that a 9-minute drum solo would be one of the most amazing moments in cinema history and one of the best endings of all time. It all crescendos beautifully, and I'm left in awe every single time I watch this movie. And the moments that Fletcher drops the tough guy act are just so touching and cathartic. Sure, it's in a Stockholm Syndrome kind of way. Seeing him go from hard-ass to impressed during the Caravan performance, then to surprised and even encouraging as Naaman continues past the song with his solo. Right before the final music cue, Fletcher and Naaman just stare at each other, completely elated as to what has just transpired. Naaman has a smile on its face, and you can tell that Fletcher does too, even though the movie does make a point of not showing you it. Fletcher's clearly nodding in approval, and it's the absolute closest thing Naaman will ever get to a good job from him. And the small moment that's no more than a few seconds in length feels like the entire world has stopped in its tracks. It's dead silent, but it couldn't be any louder, and it's one of the most moving things I've ever seen in a film. But make no mistake, despite everything I just said, this is not a happy ending by any means, which I'll get to here in a second. Right after this, the movie ends on one loud musical note, leaving us to come to our own conclusions on the implications of this grandiose moment, and what it means for Fletcher and Naaman moving forward, both individually and as a duo. And that literally could not have been a better note to end on. There are a few ways to interpret Fletcher's intentions with Naaman's final embarrassment, but I personally feel pretty confident in saying that this was the final test for Naaman, and not solely a petty act of revenge. I mean, this whole scheme is exactly something that we've seen Fletcher do repeatedly throughout the film, just on the biggest scale yet. Thematically speaking, it makes a lot more sense for this to be the final grand test of Naaman's character and abilities. This entire movie has been intertwined with the Charlie Parker metaphor. This entire movie is the Charlie Parker metaphor. And in this moment, Fletcher is Joe Jones throwing the symbol at Naaman's head. If Naaman doesn't bounce back from this, he will be utterly humiliated, just like Charlie Parker was, and possibly never work in the industry again since the audience is filled with really important figures. And how did Charlie Parker respond to the symbol being thrown at his head? He eventually went on to play the greatest motherfucking solo that the world has ever seen. And that's exactly what we're watching play out here, these two recreating the metaphor in the literal sense. Sure, there is definitely an element of revenge here, but I honestly don't think it's the main focus. As I said earlier, Naaman made a conscious choice to walk into that bar when he saw Fletcher's name, and then even goes further to indulge him with a conversation. Just about anyone in the world would have kept on walking, but Naaman did not. And I absolutely think that's something that Fletcher notices and appreciates. Even after all this time, and after all that Naaman was put through, he still bothered to walk into that bar. And it shows that he still cares and still has a desire for success. Fletcher admits that he never really saw anything in Connolly, and mentions that Tanner switches his major entirely. So Naaman is quite literally the last man standing. The other two drummers didn't walk into that bar, Naaman did. And I think that's why Fletcher sets up Naaman in the way that he does. It's the final means of seeing if Naaman really does have the guts to be great. But it's also the perfect opportunity to get back at the little shit that cost him his job. So if Naaman fails, then Fletcher still wins by getting one over on him. It's a win-win for the man. But it being a test also fits very well with the nature of Fletcher's character. He wants to mold someone into greatness, and that's been a very clear motivation for him. So when a kid that he used to see something in shows back up despite all of the abuse that he was put through, and still shows hints of determination and a desire for greatness, I don't see Fletcher just throwing away that opportunity on a revenge plot. He cares too much about his own goals. The revenge just happens to be an added benefit if Naaman fails to rise to the occasion. And going further with this idea, Fletcher was willing to deliberately sabotage his own band and his reputation in order to embarrass Naaman. He makes multiple threats to people throughout the entire film that they better not sabotage his band, and then right here at the end is willing to do so himself. And if you take a look at the band, we're not really given any indication that there are any other drummers besides Naaman. No one else is anywhere near the drum set like we've seen throughout the entire film, where an alternate is always sitting next to the core drummer. And no one approaches the drums after Naaman storms off. And I think that's intentional because I think it shows that there was no backup plan. If Naaman failed to rise to the occasion, then the performance would have gone on without a drummer. And yeah, I see how this point could be used as evidence either way. You could also argue that Fletcher really had nothing to lose at this point, as his name and reputation had already been tarnished by being outed from Schaefer, so he might as well get revenge when he sees the opportunity. Why not? But I think the fact that he's still clearly a very prestigious conductor, who still managed to assemble another highly talented band that had the ability to play for an audience filled with industry figures, shows that Fletcher being outed from Schaefer really didn't impact him all that harshly. He's clearly still renowned, and he still has a reputation he could lose. And I think what Fletcher says to Naaman immediately after embarrassing him is also very telling. He could have said one of his many insane and petty Fletcherisms, but he chose to simply say,
Yeah, I guess maybe you don't have it.
It's such a simple and effective line that can wear on Naaman's psyche in two ways: tear him down or give him motivation to prove Fletcher wrong. When Naaman returns to the stage and begins to play Caravan, Fletcher doesn't kick him off stage, which he could have done at any point, as he already sabotaged himself in front of the crowd. So stopping the performance to have Naaman escorted out wouldn't have really been a big deal. And the reason he doesn't do so is because he wants to see what Naaman can do. He wants to see if he can pass this test. And I think the section where Naaman is playing Caravan with the band and not the insane solo is actually the portion of the test. Naaman takes charge and plays the song to perfection. It's only when Naaman begins the solo that Fletcher seems genuinely perplexed, dropping the angry man persona and walking up to him and asking,
Andrew, what are you doing, man? I'll cue you.
It's the solo where Naaman is going above and beyond to show that he has achieved greatness. He's proven that he can pass any test, and now he's showing off what he can really do, beyond the rigidity of Fletcher's methods. And when Naaman eventually does his solo, Fletcher actively encourages it. He gets the band to stand down, lets Naaman play, and even helps him when his cymbal collapses, and gives him timing cues of when to bring his beat down to near non-existence and when to bring it all the way back up again. He wants Naaman to succeed here because it directly lines up with his own goals. All a very long way to say that when you compound all of this, I think it shows that Fletcher was motivated beyond just retribution. There are many ways that the ending and the moments leading up to it can be interpreted. Anything from uplifting to utterly tragic. And I think it all kind of depends on just your personal outlook on life and success. I personally always leave the film very fired up, even though I fully recognize that the ending is not happy. Naaman proving himself with an amazing drum solo for the entire world to see, despite all of the intense abuse inflicted upon him by his mentor, will never have the catharsis stripped of it for me, even if the broader implications are harder to come to terms with. It's a badass moment, and that can never be taken away. However, it's also utterly tragic the second you look at it any deeper than just an underdog story, which it is not. This is the moment where Naaman Naaman officially and unequivocally sells his soul to the devil for success. He has chosen to sacrifice his humanity in its entirety to be one of the greats, as symbolized by turning away from his father one final time. And when Naaman's father looks at Naaman playing the drums, it is not a look of admiration. It is a combination of bewilderment and horror. On one hand, he is utterly stunned that his son can play the drums with such ferocity, but he's also horrified by the extreme nature of all of it. How he's hacking away and achieving a drum solo that can only be done and accomplished by extremely obsessive behavior. It is a terrified expression of, what the fuck has my son become? The recurring theme of this film is that the greats like Charlie Parker have not had long or happy lives. Charlie Parker himself having died broke and alone, and Sean Casey hung himself from depression and anxiety as a result of the extreme methods that Fletcher imposed on him. So when we see Naaman pull off this performance, it leaves us to determine if he's going to end up the exact same way at some point. He pushed away his family, his girlfriend, and he has no friends whatsoever. All he has in his life is drumming and Fletcher. That is certainly not an easy life, as I don't really see Fletcher taking it easy on Naaman just because he nailed one solo. Fletcher's whole philosophy is that any kind of contentment leads to depriving the world of another measure of greatness. So I see these two right back at each other's throats very shortly, a pattern that kept repeating the entire movie. Naaman achieves something, Fletcher tears him down. Naaman achieves something again, Fletcher tears him down again. Rinse and repeat. Naaman is fully on the path to becoming another great that dies tragically young, and we have no reason to believe that he will end up any differently. Thematically speaking, based on everything else we've seen in the entire movie, with all of the Charlie Parker metaphors, this ending is not as hopeful as it initially appears, and that's the point. It looks like an underdog story, but Naaman didn't achieve greatness in spite of Fletcher. He achieved greatness because of Fletcher. He never once attempted to achieve greatness while also maintaining and balancing a social life. That would have been the underdog victory. Instead, he actively leaned into the idea that he'd rather die young and sacrifice everything, all while craving Fletcher's unattainable approval. So, by the end of the story, what he really is an obedient pupil who manages to pass yet another grand test by his sadistic mentor, and really just manages to take one step closer to an early grave. That's not exactly a happy ending. As I said in the beginning, and like 1,000 times throughout, this is a film about how much you are willing to sacrifice to achieve success. And now we've seen just how far Naaman is willing to go. Even though he gives a stellar performance, and yeah, it is insanely badass, is that worth all the physical and emotional abuse? All the lost relationships? And the potential to die young, broke, and alone, possibly by his own hand? That's really up to you to come to terms with on your own. And it's why the movie cuts off before any of those questions can be explicitly answered. I mean, just think about it. This movie becomes way less interesting if it shows you even a single scene past that performance. It is just such a perfect ending note. So to wrap things up, yeah, I just absolutely love this movie, and I really do consider it a masterpiece. Sure, it's got a few elements that could use some development, but this movie is as close to perfect as I can imagine. I think that it brilliantly handles the themes that it tackles, and it explores success, mentor relationships, and competition in manners that are very intimate to people, yet not often explored in film. Most films with this subject matter would just take the underdog route through and through. But Whiplash goes beyond that, and forces you to confront the more sinister nature that these elements can be perverted into. As someone who has had experiences with a couple different Fletchers in my life, both on a personal and competitive level, I related to this movie probably more than I have just about any other film. I cannot even begin to describe how Chazelle elicited very specific and heightened emotions that can only be brought out by mentors in competitive situations. He takes a very simple premise and manages to derive insanely profound themes by threading through only one single metaphor. Everything is sharply focused, and the conclusions that we draw are more reflective of ourselves than the actual statements that the movie makes, which are pretty straight to the point. And I think that is insanely impressive writing. So congrats, Chazelle, you achieved greatness with this one. You gave the world something truly wonderful. I want to thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode. As you can tell, I just really love this movie, and I'm always very excited to talk about it and to show it to other people. I initially planned for this video to be more on the shorter side, but once I started typing it up, I realized I didn't want to leave any of my thoughts off the table. So if you stuck around to the end, thank you so much for listening to my ramblings on a movie that means a lot to me. I really do put in a whole lot of effort into making these videos, and I'm sorry that I don't post more, but I do everything myself, and I also have a full-time job, so sometimes it can take weeks just to get a script written out, and that's not even talking about all the clips I have to compile for these, which can sometimes be a fucking nightmare. So needless to say, I am extremely thankful for those who take time out of their day to actually give one of my videos a watch. It really does mean a whole lot to me, and it really makes me feel like my time and effort pay off. I also want to give credit where it's due. Like I said, this is one of my favorite movies, so I have watched so many Whiplash analysis videos over the years. I honestly couldn't even begin to link all of them because I couldn't tell you which ones I've watched. I've watched so many of them. And obviously I never intend to just parrot what I see in another video, but you know, sometimes some overlap can happen, especially if someone says something that I'm like, oh yeah, that's a good point, let me kind of like expand on that. So if I've said anything that you might have heard in another video or in your videos and you know it's not linked below, just let me know. I will absolutely give you credit for it. I just love talking about this film, so anything I can do to give credit where it's due. So yeah, check out some of the other videos that I've linked in the description of people talking about this topic, and listen to what they have to say because I thoroughly enjoyed all of them. So again, thank you guys so much for watching. Keep an eye out for the next video, and I'll see you then. I've been filming for 6 hours.